Good morning again. Our first reading, if you're new with us this morning, typically we pair some non-biblical reading with a Bible reading. So our first one this morning is from the poet Clint Smith. It's called Chaos Theory. I hear in it the miracle of each of us being who we are, where we are, with the people we're with. So embracing the miracle of each of you. Chaos theory. If 20 million years ago the butterfly flew in a different direction, do you think we would have met? I'm assuming I should just back up. I'm assuming everyone knows the butterfly chaos theory, that if a butterfly's wings change the wind just enough that it could create a cascade of difference over thousands of years. So, if 20 million years ago the butterfly flew in a different direction, do you think we would have met? Maybe we wouldn't have even been people. Maybe we wouldn't have even been us, Maybe you would have been a tortoise and I would be a raspberry. Maybe we would both be plants on opposite sides of the same coral reef so that we could have been connected without ever having met. Maybe I would be an oak cut down to be the home that held you. Maybe I would have never been. Maybe the butterfly's wings would have blown the seed into the river and away from the soil, which otherwise would have become a bush of blueberries, which otherwise would have been eaten by a squirrel or some other prehistoric rodent, which otherwise would have died in a field of milkweeds, which otherwise would have been carried by the wind to another place, which otherwise might have gotten caught in the feathers of the bird, which otherwise might have flown to the other side of the sea. I could go on, but what I mean to say is that it would have been such a tragedy if something happened that would have prevented me from meeting you, like a butterfly who didn't realize it was flying in the wrong direction. The gospel lesson, the Bible reading, is the assigned gospel reading from today. It's from Mark chapter 3. Jesus is engaged in a fight here, a fight of words. It's kind of an odd one, so we'll see where it takes us. Then Jesus went home. I love there's a Bible verse that says, then Jesus went home. After church, just follow the example of Jesus. Go home. Unless you're sticking around for aging with mischief. Anyway, then Jesus went home. And again, such a crowd gathered that he and the disciples were unable to even eat a meal. When his family heard it, they went out to restrain him, for people were saying, he has gone out of his mind. And the scribes who came down from Jerusalem said, he has Beelzebul, and by the ruler of the demons he casts out demons. And he called to them, and he spoke to them in parables. How can Satan cast out Satan? If a kingdom is divided against itself, that kingdom cannot stand. And if a house is divided against itself, that house will not be able to stand. And if Satan has risen up against himself and is divided, he cannot stand. Already he's saying, well, if I'm doing what you say I'm doing, then I'm defeating the devil. He says, and his end has come. He says, but no one can enter a strong man's house and plunder his property without first tying up the strong man. Then indeed the house can be plundered. Truly, I tell you, people will be forgiven for their sins and whatever blasphemies they utter, but whoever blasphemes against the Holy Spirit can never have forgiveness, but is guilty of an eternal sin. He said this because they had said, he's got an unclean spirit. I interrupt this reading with a public service announcement. That verse right there has led generations of impressionable young children to lie awake through the night in terror that they have said the one thing that God will never forgive. So I just think it's worth taking a moment to notice that Jesus said this in the heat of a fight with religious authorities and said it to them as they were accusing him of working for the devil's team. So whatever you've said, whatever's come out of your mouth, whatever thoughts have run through your head, let me reassure you, you are God's beloved child. All right, back to the reading. Then his mother and brothers came, and standing outside, they sent to him and called him. And a crowd was sitting around him, and they said to him, "Your mother and your siblings are outside looking for you." And he replied, "Who are my mother and my siblings?" Looking at those who were seated around him, he said, "Here are my mother and my siblings. Whoever does the will of God is my brother and my sister and my mother." This is God's news. How do you know that you belong? This is the question Priscilla was getting out with the kids. What makes you feel included? I was not here last week, but I was looking at the things people wrote and laid around the baptismal font, and maybe this was a similar theme. I don't know, there's kind of beautiful things written there. A couple of weeks ago, NPR ran a story about chronic school absenteeism in kindergarten. Last year, in the state of California, more than 1 out of every 3 kindergartners missed school habitually. Part of it might still be some weird pandemic hangover, even though those kindergartners were just infants when the shutdowns all happened. Still, I think people have some anxieties and hard to get back into the rhythms. But in the Livingston Union School District, that district is bucking the trend. It's in the state's Central Valley, which is an agricultural area with the student population is about 80% Latino. And NPR sent a reporter to find out what was going on in this particular area that was cutting down on the absenteeism in kindergarten. They went to 2 schools. The first one, it seems like it all starts with the principal, the one in charge, the visible one in charge, and then trickle down through the rest of the faculty. The principal, Maite Ramirez, waits out front of the school each morning so that she is the first face that the students see when they're dropped off. She welcomes them with a smile. She lets them know that she's happy to see them. And sometimes kids are anxious and still don't want to come into school. So on the radio broadcast, you hear about one child who doesn't want to get out of the back of his mom's car. And the principal leans right into the car and says, "Come and help me, my love. Come on, you're going to have a great day." And he does. It's an example of the school culture that she's trying to cultivate, make kids know that they belong there. Experts say that one of the greatest predictors of a child's success in school lies in their answer to one simple question, which is there an adult at school who cares about you? If the kid can answer yes, that makes a world of difference. So a principal helping to create a culture of belonging is really important. But it was the story from the second school that really melted my heart. In Diana Dickey's kindergarten classroom, she greets all the kids at the start of the day. Then she tells them that there's one student who is absent that day. And she says, "If I find out that he's sick or something, I'll let you guys know, so we'll be happy to welcome him back when he comes back." And then she has some kids come up to the whiteboard where she's got a photograph of each child in the classroom. And kids take the picture of the absent boy and they move it on the whiteboard into a heart that she's drawn. They put his picture in the middle of the heart. And then she and that room full of 5-year-olds look at the picture and do a little chant. Boom, boom, pow. I don't know what that means, except that it's probably just for the rhythm of it. Boom, boom, pow, we miss you and we wish you well. If that is not one of the world's most powerful prayers, I don't know what is. It's a ritual to start the day in which the kids learn that each one of them matters. That ritual that says we care about our classmates who are absent, that also helps them internalize the idea that if I'm absent, my classmates are going to say how they miss me as well. I am important just as my classmates are important. In another room in that same school, the teacher announces that to her kindergarten class that everyone is present that day. And so the kids chant, "Hip, hip, hooray, everyone is here today." And then the teacher says, "Do it one more time, but louder. Hip, hip, hooray, everyone is here today." How do you know that you belong? Hip, hip, hooray, look at all these people here today. The part of that story that really threatened to get the waterworks going, y'all know I'm an easy crier, was about a little boy who is sometimes afraid to come into the school or to walk in the hallway when they've got to line up for things. The reporter happened to be there when this little boy got dropped off, and it was warm outside. He said, but this kid had a fleece blanket wrapped around his shoulders as a way to comfort himself. And this is the part that I hadn't expected. The reporter noticed there's another little boy leaning against the front wall. That little boy's name was Sebastian. Sebastian got himself on the radio that day. It's his job to wait for the anxious child. So every morning he takes up that post against the wall. The reporter asks him why, and he says, because I take him to the class. I always play with him. I show him how to do a lot of things. I'm a nice friend. Right on cue, he holds out his hand to this nervous little child, and the child takes his hand, and then hand in hand, they walk into the school building. Oh. How do you know that you belong? What makes you feel included? And are there practices you have that extend that same message to others? At the point in Mark's gospel that we read from this morning, it's just chapter 3 out of 16 chapters, so it's still right at the beginning of stuff. But right then, Jesus had started to amass a following. Largely, it was because he was going from place to place and healing people who were in need of healing. And if we get hung up on the supernatural elements of this story, we can think about it this way. We can notice that illness and disability in that society, as in this society, created, and maybe was created by, boundaries and obstacles and social exclusion. So that what Jesus was doing was traveling around, engaging in practices that included people and reconnected them to their communities, to remind everyone that they belonged, in other words. And of course, this got him in trouble with religious leaders. People who are accustomed to being looked up to and seen as authorities don't always take it kindly when someone else starts getting attention. So the religious leaders accused Jesus, again, of working for the devil's team. And his family had heard enough comments about, that boy of yours has lost his mind, that they started to feel anxious, like they had to do something. They wanted to convince him to quiet down, come back home, stop drawing attention, don't stir up trouble. Remember, for healing people. He wouldn't even go outside to talk with his mom and his siblings when they asked him to. In the ancient Near East, that was almost obscenely shocking. The family was the basic unit of how you know who you are and how you project who you are. Your top loyalty, the group that required the highest allegiance. So here Jesus turned that all upside down. Who are my mother and my siblings? Those who do the will of God, he said. Those who nurture connection instead of enforcing barriers and obstacles. Which, what I noticed this week is he's really given us the idea of chosen family. I'll be honest, when it comes to church, I tend to shy away from the language of church family. Priscilla and I differ on that point. You might have noticed that. I know that the language of church family is really important to some of you here as well. I generally think of church and family as distinct entities that have different sets of dynamics. Like, my family has never given me a paycheck. But, although, Dad, thank you for pledging. That throws off my point a little bit, I guess. Anyway, I don't really see a moral imperative to whether or not you use that term. You can use it if it's meaningful for you, and don't if you don't. But it's striking to me, as I read this story, and as I preach on it in the second Sunday of Pride Month, that this is a great gospel example of chosen family. That Jesus has illustrated the possibility that bonds that come about through mutual love and support can be stronger than the bonds that are created by the happenstance of genetics. It also made me think this week about a line from a poem. Surprise, I know. It's an older poem. As World War II raged, the poet W.H. Auden wrote a poem called September 1, 1939. That was the date that Germany invaded Poland, recognized as starting the war. And Auden had grown up in England but moved to New York City. So he starts the poem by setting himself in a dive bar in the city. And he says he's uncertain and afraid as the clever hopes expire of a low, dishonest decade of everything that led to the war. He had lived through the First World War as a child in England. He saw the impact of tribalist nationalism, what happens when we call our nation our highest allegiance, and I don't know, want to make it great again? Was that subtle enough? The poem includes this brilliant phrase. He says, "I and the public know what all school children learn. Those to whom evil is done do evil in return." I almost wonder if he would have responded to nationalist language of a motherland and a fatherland with a question like, who is my mother and my father and my siblings? I'm certain that Jesus would have found resonance with his line from this poem, one of my favorite lines of poetry: "We must love one another or die." Blind allegiance to any group, whether the nuclear family or extended family or a political tribe or a nation or a religious group, blind allegiance can be deadly. Jesus calls us to something that is bigger than that. How do you know that you belong? And how do you help others do the same? Jesus' opponents said he was in league with the devil. He replied with a cryptic parable about tying up a strong man so you can plunder his house. It was as if to say, you're accusing me of working with the source of the world's suffering, but I'm actually working to relieve it. What are you doing? It's an aggressive, it's almost a violent metaphor. This image of breaking into a house, tying someone up and leaving them there while you plunder everything. It's an image of invasion and conflict and struggle, and certainly it's an image that knows that the forces and systems that create suffering in the world don't stop doing so just because we ask politely. But who knew that binding the strong man might look like this? A 5-year-old reaching out his hand so another anxious 5-year-old can walk inside school with him. How do you know that you belong? When we baptize people here or receive new members, the liturgy that we use all has us recite this: you belong to us. We belong to you. Along with the entire universe, we all belong to God. I think the heart of this confounding parable, confounding gospel reading, is just this: that we live the most fully into the family of God when we figure out how to put that into practice. That you belong to us, and we belong to you. And along with the entire universe, we all belong to God. This is God's good news. Amen.